Good morning, good afternoon. I am René Zandbergen. Welcome to my talk about the probable sale of the Voynich manuscript to Rudolf II. Unfortunately, I cannot attend today, so this talk has been pre-recorded. Ever since the 2022 Voynich Manuscript Conference, people will be aware that a likely seller of the Voynich manuscript to Rudolf has been identified, the Augsburg physician Karl Wiedemann. This was explained in a presentation by Stefan Guzzi of Berlin, which has been recorded on video. He also produced a 10-page paper. Some people will have seen one or the other. Both are available online. I had long suspected Wiedemann and mentioned him already at the 2012 conference in Villa Mondragone on the basis of only a small part of the evidence that we now have. Stefan also produced a lengthy paper in German in 2023 of some 70 pages, which is not easily accessible for most. Today's talk has two parts. The first is to show and explain the evidence for Wiedemann as the seller, including many details from the long paper and some of my own thoughts. The second is to make an overview of subsequent events. By the way, yesterday, 2 August, would have been Wiedemann's 470th birthday. This shows a relatively well-known portrait of Rudolf II by the contemporary painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo. Somewhat less known, but perhaps of interest for our topic, is another portrait by Arcimboldo of a presumably anonymous librarian. It all starts with the Marzi letter, which clearly states that Rudolf bought the manuscript for 600 ducats, which are gold coins. Marzi learned this from a certain Dr. Raphael at the time when the latter was a teacher for the then King Ferdinand III of Bohemia. Fortunately, Rudolf's financial administration was very thorough. Chronological index books were kept, listing every document, for example a letter, that entered the court, and every document that left. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the actual documents has not survived. These index volumes are now preserved in Vienna. Even better, there are alphabetical name indices to these index books. This slide shows some photos of these volumes, which I took when I visited the archives in 2009. These books are complete for Rudolf's reign and cover over 100 meters of shelf space. Even more interestingly, a large part of these records has been transcribed by Manfred Staudinger and others. While this resource was offline for a considerable period of time, it is now back up. Essentially all records are in German. I had downloaded these around 2008, but searching them was quite cumbersome due to the inconsistent spelling. The top of this slide shows the start page. After clicking on the first button, one obtains an alphabetical index to many hundreds of people's names. Just as an example, the entry for Edward Kelly is shown below that, with links to a number of interesting records for him. Note that not all entries are in the finance books, but also in other archival records. Remarkably, we also see that Kelly's 470th birthday would have been 2 days ago. He was exactly 1 day older than Wiedemann. As a second example, this slide shows a long list of people who received a low-end salary from Rudolf II for being court servant with 2 horses. This means they would receive 2 times 10 florins per month, enough to support himself and 1 servant. Jakub Horczycki is mentioned on this list. The total for this list would have been of the order of 1,500 florins per month. In the meantime, these court ledgers have also been scanned and are available digitally online. This slide shows the entry page with links to each of the individual volumes. For each year, there are at least an entry protocol, an exit protocol, and name indices to both. This slide shows the start page of volume 524, the exit protocol for the year 1599. The handwriting is typical for this time frame. It uses some abbreviations and requires significant training before I can read it. I can say that I am not able to. Having gone through the downloaded transcriptions, I found the Wiedemann entry for 500 thaler, which is approximately the right amount, to be one of the most promising, but I had little confidence because I did not know how complete my information was. It refers to the seller Wiedemann, of whom we have no portrait, and an intermediary named Zacharias Geiskofler, who was responsible for buying the books, paying Wiedemann, and bringing them to Prague. This shows the barely legible entry, its transcription, a translation of the relevant part, and the portrait of Geiskofler. Later, I found a second reference to this book deal that made it much more interesting, as it also said that the books were unusual. Geiskofler had his own family archive in a town not too far from where I lived, namely Ludwigsburg. Furthermore, two lengthy publications from the Austrian Akademie der Wissenschaften listed all 2,473 entries in these records related to artworks, in which they included books. This made the list of book deals of Rudolf much more complete. Around this time, I was contacted by Stefan Guzzi, who then took the lead in this research. Stefan discovered a great deal of additional information related to Wiedemann, mostly reflected in his second long paper. The results will be shown below, but let us first look at a short biography of Wiedemann. He was born in Munich in 1555, but the family soon moved to Augsburg for religion-related issues. He attended several universities, Leipzig, Padova and Dol, and obtained doctorates in Padova and Dol. He wanted to become a practicing physician in Augsburg, but he had trouble because the relevance of his doctorate was doubted. In 1587 he went to Bohemia, probably aided by his study friend Johannes Gruber, who was working for Rosenberg in Trebon. Wiedemann also worked for the Rosenbergs and certainly also met and worked with Edward Kelly. A notebook from this time survives, and so does his farewell letter to Rosenberg when he left. He went back to Augsburg after half a year. In 1588, Leonhard Rauwolf, who was an Augsburg city doctor, left for Linz, also for religious reasons. But he stayed a citizen and kept his house. Immediately upon returning from Bohemia, Wiedemann took over this position and moved into Rauwolf's house. Rauwolf had studied medicine in France and was an avid herb collector, which he glued into books, creating so-called herbaria viva. He had traveled to the Near East to find new herb species for medicinal use. Wiedemann's income was 200 florins per year. He had already been collecting and copying manuscripts, and at this time he intensified this work. He is known for preserving most of Paracelsus' work this way, but he also copied many alchemical texts. In 1596, Rauwolf died, followed by his widow in 1597. Wiedemann could not afford to buy the house he was staying in, so he had to move out. Here are a few pages of Wiedemann's notebook written while he was in Bohemia. On the left are references to Hermes, Aristoteles and St. Thomas Aquinas. The text mainly concentrates on recipes involving mercury, lead and a white tincture. It consists of close to 30 pages. I do not have a complete copy, and Kelly's name should be mentioned in the part that I do not have. This shows the location of the house of Rauwolf and Wiedemann in the Grottenau in Augsburg. These patricians' houses were destroyed in the Second World War, and now it is entirely modern. The photo on the right was taken eastwards, from in front of the theater that still exists. This is the oldest likely location where the Voynich manuscript has been kept. Let us now look at the details of the book sales to Rudolf by Wiedemann. Stefan Guzzi visited several of the aforementioned archives. He went to Vienna for a few days with a long list of items to search for, but he encountered severe limitations in the number of items one could request on any day. We later hired a student to do additional searches. Numerous additional documents still exist, only a small part of the original set, and not yet very well researched. There may still be useful information there. The first relevant sale is a Kunstbuch on 21 November 1597 for 100 florins, but the seller is unknown. The transcription from Manfred Staudinger is shown here. That the sale was from Augsburg follows from other records. This sale was facilitated by Zacharias Geiskofler, and the book was handed to Hans Popp. Guzzi explains that the term Kunstbuch does not refer to art in the modern sense of the word, but to crafts and science. It was the word also used specifically for alchemy. From other correspondence, it follows that Geizkofler was asked to get more, leading Guzzi to assume that the first sale was from the same person as the next we will discuss. The next sale was the 500 thaler deal of several books from Wiedemann by Geizkofler and again handed to Hans Popp, who died shortly after, before June 1599. This slide shows 4 transcriptions. The first 2 are from the time of the sale on 1 March 1599, explaining that Geizkofler should pay 500 thaler to Karl Wiedemann of Augsburg for some books, and there is also a need for a carpenter with 2 aides who can work with ebony. The thaler is a silver coin that at this time was worth more than a florin or a ducat. The next 2 records are from February 1600 but refer back to this sale. Geizkofler receives another 24 florins for additional expenses. Further details, including links to the scans, are provided at my website. The latter entries again mention several books, but also the interesting fact that they are unusual. Guzzi's first step had been to visit Ludwigsburg. I had already decided not to go there, as I would not be able to read most of the material anyway. The Ludwigsburg records indicate that Geizkofler got 500 thaler from Rudolf, but the actual sale to Wiedemann was for 600 florins. The invoice has number 127, and a copy exists both in Ludwigsburg, shown here, and in Augsburg. Another sale of books still in 1599 was for 3 books for 50 thaler. This does not seem to appear in the Hofkammer records, but Wiedemann's receipt has been preserved in Vienna. He tried to sell most of his library later in life, but could not find any buyer. His library catalogues are still preserved, and so is a very long autograph that has also been digitized as requested by Guzzi and myself. Both are from well after the 1599 sale, so may not provide any further information about the Voynich manuscript. The sale, that probably included the Voynich manuscript, must have involved numerous books. Several of his autographs, copies or originals, some with covers adorned by Rudolf's arms, can still be identified. These were looted by the Swedes in 1648, taken to Stockholm and catalogued there by Isaac Vossius. Vossius later received these from the Queen, and they are now in Leiden. This catalogue was published by Kalmar. Here I show some low-quality scans of that publication. The title page, a copy of the entry of Rauwolf's Herbaria Viva, and on the right a list of present-day locations of some of the manuscripts that are of interest to us. Note that none of these books should be considered unusual. In particular, Vossius Kim Q56 is one of 2 books in Leiden that still have a cover with the arms of Rudolf. This shows a photo of it, which was kindly provided to me recently by a Leiden library staff member. There is a chance, though a small one, that at one point in time the Voynich manuscript may have also looked like this. Just for fun, let me show it side by side with Archimboldo's Librarian. The similarity of one of his books, though not perfect, is remarkable. Was the librarian holding the Voynich manuscript here? Wiedemann's notebook with alchemical recipes that was shown before is now in the Strahov monastery in Prague. Based on this, Guzzi assumes that it was also part of the sales to Rudolf. I would like to speculate that this may well have been the Kunstbuch that was initially sold for 100 florins. The term Kunstbuch fits very well, but the main reason for this thought is that it refers to the work of Kelly. Rudolf had always wanted to obtain Kelly's secrets of transmutation, and Kelly had always delayed that. We may assume that this was because Kelly was not really able to do it. Now, Kelly died in 1597, and this sale took place in the same year. This is certainly speculation, and we may never find out if it's correct, but it also plays no role for our further investigation. 600 gold pieces, whether ducats or florins, was certainly a lot of money. Both coins were 3.5 grams of solid gold alloy. the ducat probably more pure. So the price was equivalent with 2.1 kilograms of gold. This is worth roughly 200,000 euros or dollars nowadays. The high price has already raised questions in the past, but this was more a question of whether Marzi was exaggerating or not. Now we know that a sale of exactly this amount exists. For Wiedemann, this was 3 years of salary. From the total of known transactions, we see that this is quite a large amount for Rudolf to spend on books. At the same time, it is not at all an outlier. He did also spend larger amounts, usually on collections of books. Undoubtedly, for such an amount of money, Rudolf must have known in advance what he was buying. There's evidence of correspondence between Wiedemann and Rudolf, but no details have been preserved. To show the extent of Rudolf's acquisitions, this transcription is a list of his debts after his death. It shows debts to individuals of thousands to tens of thousands of thaler, and this is just the top of the list. My main worry in 2012 was the completeness of the information that I had. This improved over the years, and Stefan Guzzi has analyzed this further. While Rudolf II had a wide interest in many topics, he was not too deeply interested in books per se. The Imperial Library was in Vienna and stayed there when Rudolf left Vienna for Prague. It ran on a very modest budget. He has occasionally had books sent over to him, but not very many. He had a second library in Prague, and then there was his Kunstkammer, with a catalogue including some 250 books. Altogether, it is estimated that he would have owned fewer than 1,000 books. When the Swedes looted Prague in 1646 to 1648 and took many treasures to Sweden, their main booty in terms of books was the Rosenberg library of some 11,000 volumes. Again, from catalogues made in Sweden soon after this, it is clear that there was relatively little from Rudolf. Guzzi's paper includes 126 book acquisitions, and this is likely to be quite complete. It is known that some minor cases are not included, but it is relatively unlikely that such a major acquisition would be missing. This is one excerpt of the detailed list in Guzzi's paper. It shows many items labeled as Verehrung, which means a book dedicated to Rudolf. These were usually presented to him by the author, who would hope to receive some reward in return for the dedication. Top of the list is Giordano Bruno, who received a large amount of 300 thaler for this. It also includes Rauwolf's sale of his Herbaria Viva for 310 thaler. This sale took place after his move to Linz, but he had been interested in selling them for a much longer time. This is an interesting story by itself, for which unfortunately there is not enough time now. A second excerpt shows some famous names. A case of 2,000 thaler included some gold items, and the exceptional 20,000 thaler was for Tycho Brahe's books and astronomical instruments, which are still preserved in Prague. Tycho's collaborator and successor Johannes Kepler only received 100 thaler for a book dedication. Wiedemann was a manuscript collector, and he had a library of some 1,000 items towards the end of his life. He received items from friends and contacts from a wider area, including Germany and France. However, he was never very rich and could not have afforded to spend even 1/10 of 600 florins on any book. Wiedemann lived in Rauwolf's house until the latter died. Guzzi favors the possibility that the Voynich manuscript was part of Rauwolf's library, which included also some 1,000 items and would have contained medical and herbal books. This library was up for sale, but could not be sold, and it was later included in the Linz city library. Unfortunately, this was lost through a fire. Wiedemann may have been one of Rauwolf's heirs, but there is no hard evidence that he obtained any of his books. There is a tantalizing record that Rauwolf had once borrowed 600 florins from someone from the Zimmermann family, which is also the name of Wiedemann's wife. However, this amount was paid back. It seems to be just a coincidence. If this manuscript was a gift, it must have been from a wealthy person. Rosenberg is a candidate, but again, there is no evidence for this. Clearly, Wiedemann knew how and from whom he got the manuscript, but how much of this information also passed to Rudolf's court, and especially to Dr. Raphael Mniszowski. The people who certainly knew more were Geistkofler and Popp. The former was an accountant who lived in Augsburg and died in 1617. Popp is more interesting. He was intimately familiar with Rudolf's interests, but he died within months after he'd received the manuscript. Rudolf's court records mention 500 thaler, but not 600 florins. This may have been verbal information, or some document related to the sale that is now lost recorded this. Kelly died in 1597, so he plays no role. Tepinec and Barcius were still students in 1599. We have a gap of information from 1599 to 1622, with some milestones in between. Mniszowski, the source for Marzi, probably was not yet involved in 1599. He was born in 1580. Still, he was appointed to an important government role by Rudolf in 1611. Tepinec did not obtain the book before 1608. Rudolf died in 1612. Marzi and Barcius entered the Prague scene in the early 1620s. Marzi probably arrived in 1622 and was a student until 1625. He must have met Barcius around 1622. Barcius is recorded as a citizen from 1624 and may have been there before, but we don't know. Tepinec left his books to the Jesuit library, but there is a surviving letter explaining that he gave some items to friends before he died. This book would not have been of any use to the Jesuit library. It may have gone into circulation just before his death in 1622. It is possible that he knew Barcius, as both were at the Clementinum and shared the same interests. There is also no evidence for this, though. We have a second gap of information from 1622 to 1637, but we know of some things that happened during this time. Mniszowski provided details of the book to Marzi between 1627 and 1637, while Ferdinand III was king of Bohemia. He may never have been the owner himself, even as Guzzi seems to assume that he was. The book was on Barcius' bookshelf in 1637 when he first approached Kircher. He may or may not have been the legal owner, but that does not seem too relevant. Mniszowski thought that the book originated with Roger Bacon, but we don't know if that opinion was shared by anybody before him. Barcius did not think so. He considered that it included medical information from a traveler to the Orient, which immediately suggests a link to Raulf, but this is speculation. There are no more major mysteries after this. There was an exchange of letters with Kircher. Mniszowski died in 1644 and Barcius died sometime after 1647. At the point of his death, he must have been the owner of the manuscript, as he left it, among other things, to Marzi in his will. Marzi sent it to Rome in 1665. Dr. Raphael is probably the most underrated person in this account. Voynich knew nothing about him until he got a letter from the Prague archives in 1921. He was largely skimmed over by the Imperial, with most of the attention going to Tepinec and Marzi. In 1630, Mniszowski wrote a very interesting letter to Emperor Ferdinand II with the aim to provide support for Michael Sendivogius, one of the most famous and successful alchemists at Rudolf's court. He wrote, among others, he, Mniszowski, had been interested in alchemy for more than 30 years, that is, since before 1600. He was one of the only people with whom Sendivogius would speak freely. Indeed, Sendivogius was not a communicative person at all. He had also researched Rudolf II's document, both in normal writing and in cipher. His interest in secret writing included Tritemius, and he had himself written a book based on some of Tritemius' principles. This book was also taken to Sweden as war booty and is still there. An epigram written about him by a friend of Marci praised him as defeating Tritemius and Geber. Sendivogius could provide a missing link, but note that there is no evidence for this, and I have been able to consult the foremost expert on his life and deeds, which is Raphael Prinke. There is no record that he ever saw the manuscript, he never mentioned it, and he almost certainly never owned it. Sendivogius was one of the two most famous alchemists at Rudolf's court, but his reputation was much better than the other one, Edward Kelly, who became known more as a charlatan. He was in and out of Prague in 1598 and 1599, and he exchanged letters both with Pop and Rudolf. Sendivogius knew Pop well and had been planning a chemical experiment to be witnessed by him, which was interrupted by the plague in 1598. Sendivogius may have seen the manuscript and learned things about it right when it arrived in 1599. Again, we have no evidence. Sendivogius died in 1637, which is when Barthius starts mentioning it, but this may just be another coincidence.
Okay. Normally I would do a Q&A, a short Q&A after the presentation, but since René isn't here, we'll just move on to the next presenter, which will be Tavi. So yeah, like René said, if you have any questions or comments about this, he shared so much information like that people who are interested in this can probably do a lot with. So just make a thread at Ninja, and he'll see your comments. I will now hand it over to Tavi if she is here, and she is going to talk about a strange creature that lurks in the grass.
Yes, what on earth is this that we see on this slide? Is it a lion? Is it a tiger? Nope, it's a Voynich Gallows glyph. So welcome everyone to our safari tour, which is Hanging Out with the Gallows, where we're going to explore the world of what may be the Voynich manuscript's weirdest glyphs or characters. Now, it's a short tour, so we won't be looking at particularly its exotic species of gallows. We won't be getting into a debate as to whether certain glyphs actually count as gallows, nor will we explore whether what we commonly see as gallows hides some different subtle variations. But what we will do on our journey through the island of Gallows is study the behavior of the most commonly recognized ones. So how their behavior differs from each other, how their behavior may differ depending on which scribe wrote them, and how their behavior differs depending on what habitat they are found in on Gallows Island. So please sit back, relax, and please keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times because some of these gallows might have teeth. So here we have Gallows Island. As you can see, the island contains a variety of habitats. In the centre Midlands, we have a lush grasslands and trees where certain gallows creatures thrive. But towards the extremes, the west and east coasts and the mountainous north, it's a different story. But we have a long journey ahead of us. So we're going to start now with the lush Midlands, or properly known the mid-text region of a Voynich paragraph. Now, the mid-text Midlands are everything in the text, but with the key extremes removed. It excludes words at line start, words at line's end, and words in the top row. And here we see a particular gallows thrive. This is the glyph that, for transcription purposes, we refer to as K. And this glyph is abundant in the manuscript. We have almost 11,000 instances in the entire manuscript. And in fact, in some of these folios, you might almost think it looks like it's in almost every word. But It's not in every word, even in this lush mid-text region that is this glyph's natural habitat. In the folios we're looking at just then, the star section, it is roughly 40% of words. And here's where it's important in our journey to recognise the influence of different scribes. So many of you will know that Lisa Fagin-Davis proposed that 5 scribes wrote the manuscript. 3 of those 5 are thought to have written particularly large sections of the manuscript, and that's what we'll look at today. The part of the herbal section written by scribe 1, which will colour code a sort of orangey yellow. The balneological section written by scribe 2, which will colour code grey. And lastly, the star section by scribe 3 in green. And here we see a difference immediately between them. For both scribe 2 and 3, we find the K gallows in approximately 40% of midline words, but in scribe 1's herbal, it's a much more modest quarter of words in the midlands. And what do we do? What do we see instead? Well, here we can meet another gallows glyph, and this is what we call the T glyph. You'll see that it's visually different from the K by its second loop there on the left. Now, for scribe 1, this appears in the midlands pretty much as the K does. They're both close to around 25%. But for the other 2 scribes, the ratio of K to the T gallows is far greater. Now, gallows glyphs tend not to hang out on their own. They get a little bit lonely. Single letter gallow words are really quite rare. And a limited set of glyphs tend to follow gallows. For the scribe 2 and scribe 3 species of gallows, the next glyph tends to be an A or an E. And actually, there's a bit of a duopoly here in the Midlands. KA and KE make up actually around 75%, so 3/4 of all K gallows here. And it's a little smaller for the T gallows, but there's still this similar dominance of these bigrams, the gallows A and the gallows E. And these tend to form words like, you can see at the bottom, and I'll try to pronounce them, quakain, quakedi, or tidi. Now, we don't see this with scribe 1, not so much. Instead, we see this combination, KCH, being the largest force here. It's managing over 1/4 there. And there's a bit more of diversity amongst the other type of glyphs that can follow gallows. And it's a similar story with T, except that the particular combination at the bottom, what we call the bench gallows formulation, is pretty much just as common. So we're already seeing sort of a clear courier-style dichotomy between the gallows species here, between the scribe 1 language A type on the one hand and the scribe 2 and 3 language B type on the other. But now it's time to visit the western coast of the paragraph, line start, or land start as we'll call it here. And this is a more barren part of the land. It's less hospitable, at least for certain types of gallows. So if we use the Midlands population as a baseline, we can predict how many K there ought to be at line start. And let's say for scribe 3, where we have 40% of K in the Midlands, this should be around 300 K gallows glyphs at line start. Yet we only get around half of that. And that's a lot missing, considering that we're only looking at, in our sample, around 800 line start words for this scribe. And most of the clusters that are missing are KA and KE, unsurprisingly, the ones that dominated in the Midlands. They're still quite powerful here at line start, but they've taken a really severe blow. And there are fewer T gallows as well than there should be. Similarly, we see fewer for scribe 2 as well. Although, actually, interestingly, although there are fewer T overall, there are still more T at word initial position than we'd have expected. So not all gallows glyphs struggle at the land start position. Some of the clusters actually perform better here than in the Midlands, even only by a small amount. For scribe 2, for example, we see small increases in the KCH, KSH, and especially TCH combinations. They're still quite small, but it's really interesting because those are sort of three clusters that actually we would typically associate with scribe 1 gallows, at least in the Midlands. Now, speaking of scribe 1, how do the K and T gallows creatures cope here at the westward line start extreme? Well, for K, actually, we see even more KCH and KSH than we would have expected. But the behavior has changed. We see fewer K in the word initial position, and now more in the word middle position, as in words like QOKCH, quotch, and OKCH, oksh. And this makes sense because initial Q and O do tend to be disproportionately common at the line start position for scribe 1, and not so much for our other scribes. Looking at T, we can see both more initial Ts and more word middle T instances than we would have expected. And the particular variety of extra T gallows does tend to be TCH clusters and sometimes TO. As well as being followed by CH, what the scribe 1 species of K gallows and T gallows have in common is that the bench gallows, seen there with the sort of gallows in the middle, definitely does not thrive in the land start coastal environment. We see far fewer than we would expect, especially CTH. Well, we've tarried too long in the west here, so it's time to start moving all the way across the Gallows Island towards the east. So the eastern coast of Land's End or Line End, the last word of all lines, excluding the top row. Now, like the western extreme, this end of the line is often not welcoming to most gallows, but certain of them do still carve out some existence here. Scribe 2 gallows seem to suffer the most here. Based on their population in the Midlands, we would expect around 250 of these at line end, but there are 100 missing. And this is mostly the KE cluster that really does not like the end of the lines here, and to a lesser extent, the KA cluster. Quite interestingly, we do see KY clusters actually doing better than expected. And this is a cluster that wasn't common at all in the lush Midlands of the text, but in the East, it quite positively thrives. And the scribe 2 T glyph also takes a knock, but it isn't quite as badly affected by the eastern coastal climate as its K cousin is. Now the scribe 3 glyph for K, right at the top there, also takes a hit here. It's about 80 instances off the predicted amount, and almost all of that is the KE cluster. But we do see some more clusters more than expected here, both the KY and TY clusters, and both the KA and TA clusters, and they're often ending words like cam and tam at line's end. And they're not large increases from what's expected, but they're still interesting given how badly KE and TE clusters struggle to cope here at the extreme. But what about the scribe 1 gallows, which are so often the outlier? So the K gallows, the K gallows here suffers here too, especially its most common cluster KCH, and the same is true for its T counterparts, TCH. But like scribe 3, we actually see KA and TA thrive here. And other T variants are also found more commonly here. In fact, actually, the T gallows appears more at line's end than we would expect for scribe 1, which is again quite a crucial difference. So we covered the west and the east, most of the continent there, and we've already seen differences between the K and the T gallows, between the scribal species, and of course between the different areas of terrain. So it's time to get back in our Jeep and head upwards now, right up into the mountains of Gallows Island. So this is the top row, the summit of each paragraph, and we're going to start by only looking at the middle of it, so excluding the first word and the last word of the row, because it's quite different to its extremes. So in the top row, we see some footprints. In fact, they seem like the footprints of a one-legged creature hopping along the mountainside. What could that be? Well, here high up in the mountains, we see the unquestionable domain of the P gallows, which positively thrives up in high altitudes. Now, the P Gallows has a sibling, the lesser spotted F glyph, with only one loop, where P has two. Now, because we've got a lot of mountains to climb here, I won't cover the behavior of the F species, but they do tend to behave like their two-loop sibling, only on a smaller scale. So how does the two-looped P glyph behave? Well, there are three behaviors that are common across all three of the scribes we're looking at. Firstly, the P glyph appears disproportionately on the top row. It can occur further south, but it isn't common. Secondly, it tends to be in PCH clusters, like a lot, really. It's almost like they're mating for life here, as we'll see later. And thirdly, it tends to be word middle. We see clusters like OPCH and QOPCH across all three scribes. But we're forgetting the other Gallows now. If we take their predictions based on the Midlands, do we see as many of them as we should expect in the middle of the top row, up high here? Well, we see differences here now, and between the scribes. There's a similarity at first. The K glyph for all three scribes does not like the high altitudes in this middle mountain position. In fact, for scribe 1 and 3, it's getting altitude sickness. There are at least 100 fewer K glyphs than we would expect. And for scribe 2, the gap is much smaller, but there is still a gap. Now, the T glyph is actually where we see the difference between the scribes. So for scribe 1, there's a small drop, and it's mainly for the CTH bench gallows. For scribe 2, actually, T appears a little bit more than we would expect up in the top row middle. And now for scribe 3, it appears far more than we would expect, based on its performance at the midline. Now, some of you may be thinking that the K glyph seems pretty elusive up in the mountains, and suddenly at the same time, we see everywhere all these one-legged P glyphs. Now, from the earliest studies of the manuscript, the strange behavior of the single-legged gallows, being predominantly in the top row, has been noted. And it seems hard to imagine a letter in the alphabet, or a cluster, only being used in the first line of paragraphs and writings. It seems quite unlanguage-like. Now, some have argued it could be a sign of another language being employed only or predominantly in the top row, but this argument doesn't really seem to cut it when we see this effect is present in most of the paragraphs of various different sections across the manuscript that seem to change in subject matter. So, if a linguistic explanation doesn't work here, where are all the K glyphs? Now, the first thought has to be they've been transformed into P. And there are some good reasons for this. They're in similar places in the word. So Kwokchedi can become, Kwokchol can become that. And the top row gives us a lot more space for ornamentation. Perhaps P is a ornamental K used when there is more space. And I think it was perhaps Philip Neal who noted that the P gallows does seem to be more common, more and more towards the right side of the line after the line in the paragraph above finishes. And there have been examples shown in Capelli of ornamental effect of certain characters up on the top row. So perhaps this is the answer. But there are problems. We've seen that KE is an extremely common cluster for scribes 2 and 3. It's over 40% of their K instances in the midtext. So if K equals P, then KE equals PE. So where are all the PE clusters? And like the Yeti, the PE cluster is quite an elusive creature in the mountains. When we look at voyniches.com, we maybe see around 8 or so, and quite a few of these look like a transcription error. So K equals P has a bit of a big problem here because we can't explain what's happening to all the KE that are missing in the top row. But, okay, what if P is not replacing K, but KE as a ligature? So that could be quite ideal. So perhaps Okiol could become a pole. But wait, hang on. When we arrived in the mountains, we noticed immediately that P is usually PCH. And in fact, it makes up quite a lot of the P clusters as we've seen. It's approximately half of all the scribe 1 P gallows in the middle of the top row. It's the same for scribe 2. And for scribe 3, it even manages around 2/3. So that is a lot of PCH, taking vast amounts of the stock of P gallows there. So if we say P is KE, then PCH is KECH. And that's the next problem then. Where are the KECH glyphs? We don't see many of them. There's some. In fact, if we look at scribe, but there's not actually that many, and there's certainly nowhere near 2/3 of K instances. And looking at scribe 3, which has the largest number of missing KE instances, then we see that this is actually almost entirely caused by the KEE cluster, and usually words ending in KECH. Sorry, usually words ending in KEEY, definitely not KECH. So we tried to solve the problem of missing K by arguing that K equals P, only to replace it with a new problem, the missing PE. And then we tried to solve the problem of the missing PE by arguing that K equals PE, only to replace it with a new problem, the missing KECH. And this is really the joys of Voynichese. Every time you find a good explanation, you create at least 3 more problems requiring explanations. Just looking at the problems other than where all the KECH clusters, we wonder where was P when K vanished at line start and line's end? There was no P there to come to the rescue. And also the numbers don't quite well match up anyway. As you see, perhaps they're best with scribe 1 there, 144 extra P and 122 missing K. But when you look at scribe 2 and scribe 3, the amount of extra P vastly dwarfs the amount of missing K, especially the amount of missing KE. It's just nowhere near there. Now, is there anything else we can think of that could at least partially explain what's going on? There are quite a lot of other Voynich glyph creatures that behave very differently up high in the mountains, and a few are common to all 3 scribes. You see them in the table there. And one possibility for why there are too many P glyphs to replace all the missing K is that maybe many of those P aren't actually replacing anything missing. They could be being added to a stem, such as initial CH words. And there's some attractive things about this. So it's a partial explanation as to why we see PCH clusters so commonly, and we don't see KCH clusters in scribes 2 and 3. Could tie in with some theories people have had about line start and paragraph start, which we've yet to visit on this tour, where it's suspected, although not proven, that the initial glyphs there are added for some reason to midline word types. At line start, we often see XS, YCH, and DCH clusters, and simultaneously many missing initial CH word types. So there could be a parallel here between what's happening at line start for CH words and what's happening at top row middle for CH words. And we can also see that many of the more common glyphs after P are actually mostly common initials. We talked about PCH, initial CH is common. We also see PO, PSH, O, and O and SH are common initials. And interestingly, we see greater instances of the PA cluster in scribe 3, and initial A is common in scribe 3 Midlands, but not so much in the other scribes. And simultaneously, we see greater instances of PY in scribe 1, where initial Y is more common in scribe 1 Midlands than elsewhere. Might even be an explanation as to why we don't see PE, because we don't see initial E words either. So there's nothing for P to be added to in order to form PE. But that would also mean believing that absolutely no P and F mutate from K. So I don't think we can say that. But again, this shows that we're trying to explain something and we end up with multiple problems. In addition to wondering what's replacing the missing KE, we have to wonder why the rest of the word types don't align well either. Why would quop and op be added in this way anyway? Because it's a little odd. It's line start, maybe there are explanations for why the initial glyph may be added, but here we're looking at the middle of the top row and often in the middle of a cluster here. So every explanation we can come up with seems to create more things needing explaining, and that's quite fascinating, but also very maddening. Now, we're straight off the beaten mountain path, but a bit into the Gulf of Speculation, so let's get back on tour here. And we're going to visit our last destination, the highest peak in the top row, Mount Paragraph Start. And this is one of the facts that everyone sees at first glance in the manuscript. The first glyphs of the paragraphs are almost always gallows. So it's not surprising if, again, we generate predictions that we see all the gallows have surpluses for where they're in the word initial position. In fact, they're actually pretty large for the P glyph, to the extent that some have suggested it might be a word for marking, sort of formatting the beginning of the paragraph. But interestingly, they feature much less than expected in word middle position. For instance, for scribe 3, we're missing over 50 word middle K here. And that's a lot when we're only looking at 300 paragraph start words. And in fact, actually, gallows don't seem to like each other much. We rarely see two gallows adjacent to each other. That's perhaps with that right loop, there's not really the space for anything to be next to the gallows, apart from the short glyphs that we often see there, like CH and O. But we also don't see gallows very often in the same word either, with a couple of glyphs between them. It does happen, and especially at this location, but not very often. But let us take a look very quickly at what glyphs do tend to associate with gallows at the top row. So we noted at paragraph start, we noted in the middle of the top row, PCH tended to dominate, and it's still a strong player here. But now we see that the PO combination is starting to rival it here, especially for scribe 2. For the T gallows, let's just have a look at scribe 3 as an example. Now the duopoly of ta and te managed to hold in all the positions, including top and middle, but now at paragraph start, it completely fails. And we see TCH and TSH are now all of a sudden the most dominant clusters, which interestingly are combinations we might previously have associated with scribe 1. If we look at K, we can actually see the cat and ke duopoly appear to hold here. But then when we look a little closely at the words themselves, almost all those words tend to be word middle, either in the rare words with two gallows like chokadi, or the rare paragraph start words that don't start with gallows like kwakidi. And when K is the initial, it tends to be in clusters like KCH, KSH, or Ko. Yet again, clusters that we associate more with scribe 1, but here we see scribe 3, a language B scribe. Now, just wrapping up, because I'm conscious of time, this brings us to the end of our whirlwind safari tour. We've seen a lot of gallows, maybe too many too quickly, but we can summarize some points to remember for future safaris. So gallows behave differently according to their type. We all know the difference between the single leg and the double leg one, that's clear, but we've seen that there actually can be differences between the K glyph and the T glyph. In particular, we're seeing T being very common in the top row, where K is often missing. They behave differently depending on the position of the word. As we can see, K and T can overperform as initials in paragraph start, and then pretty much underperform, miserable failures, as middles. It obviously, we've seen that gallows behave differently depending on the scribe, especially scribe 1 from the others. It seems to prefer different clusters. And then lastly, we've seen they behave differently depending on the position in the paragraph, whether it is the lush midland text, the western line start, the eastern line end, the mountainous middle top row, or the very dizzying heights of paragraph start. So with that, thank you for choosing to safari with us. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this ecosystem on Gallows Island and the strange creatures that call this place home. So please have a safe journey onwards.
Wow, thank you, Tavi. That was, I think, an amazing masterclass in how to do a presentation on a subject like this. That's pretty heavy in statistics and everything, but you made it so beautiful and pleasant to sit through. Very well done. There is a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see that.
I'll just have a look. How would these statistics change if you map them all to the same symbol? Oh, that's an interesting question. So if you considered all the gallows, the K, the T, the P, the F, all as the same one, and then you see, so I'm sorry, do you mean if you consider that P is K and T in the top row?
That would be a start. You can distinguish both, but
Yeah.
Most basic question is whether you suppose that the differences between the four gallows are just random noise. And there is just one letter that is the gallows. Would those statistics how would the statistics change?
I think it would
first
be
letter, first word, last word, middle word.
Yeah, so if we consider there was just one single G gallows, that would mean it takes the place of P and F at top row, which tend to be followed by clusters like CH. And then it takes the place of K and T down below, which, as we see, at least for scribes 2 and 3, tend to be followed by A and E. So it's certainly worth trying and seeing what happens. But I think you'd still end up with quite clear positional variation between the super gallows when it's in the top row and the super gallows when it's in the lower rows, and probably at the extreme as well, actually, I think. But we'd have to see, because there are some commonalities. I think we see PA quite more commonly at the line end of the top rows as well, which ties in with KA and TA often being more popular at line end. So yeah, it's an interesting thing, but we'd probably also have to separate them by scribes because they do behave differently, and that would introduce distortions if we merge them all.
Okay, thank you.
One more question from me. So I have to admit, during the middle of your presentation, I was finishing my own PowerPoint about the favorite plants tournament. And, did you find anything that feels significant in difference between scribes other than between A and B scribes?
Well, thanks for that. Now I don't feel too bad about finishing my presentation quite late too. I think it is interesting to see where there are differences between scribe 2 and scribe 3. It might be due to the lower sample, but it did, because scribe 2 seems to have fewer paragraph, or at least fewer paragraphs that we can clearly recognize as paragraphs, which means it seems that the missing K glyphs, there's not actually that many there at all. In fact, you could probably maybe just ascribe it to random chance, perhaps, if you were being a bit generous. Whereas for scribe 3, its fellow B language, it's absolutely crazy, all the missing K, etc. And the behavior of the T gallows can also vary there. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's anything sort of massively different between them, but we do see sometimes that scribe 3 can behave a little bit closer to scribe 1 than scribe 2 occasionally.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next presentation, which is by Cary Rapaport. I have a pre-recorded video here, and she'll show you a new artwork she made.
Hi, I'm Cary Rapaport, and I make sculptures inspired by illustrations in the Voynich manuscript. I work with porcelain, flame-worked glass, and illuminated plasma. In this video, I'll be showing the process of working with porcelain clay to bring the illustrations of Folio 81R to life. And at the end, I'll reveal a new Voynich sculpture. After making the pool shape, I began to sculpt the female figures, or, as researchers of the manuscript know them, the nymphs. My goal is to sculpt the nymphs exactly as they were originally drawn. Through closely studying these images, I developed a style that captures the idiosyncrasies of the Voynich manuscript artist. I'm not going for realistic body proportions so much as unrealistic body proportions, but in a very specific way. The clay is still very soft at this stage, so I'm able to add more clay to the face. Like, for example, I want the nose to be a little bit different shape, I'm also going to add quite a bit more clay to the forehead. Some particular nymphs have this really strange curve to their forehead, so I'm trying to recreate that. Part of modeling in 3 dimensions, I'm also having to imagine how the back of the hair would look, some extra details like the crown. I always like to make it look kind of ambiguous with the hair and the crown sort of merging together. I go in with lots of little detail sculpting tools. Porcelain has to dry very, very slowly and gradually, or it can crack. So this sculpture is going to have to dry for probably a couple of weeks before it can even be fired in the kiln. I went through a similar process to make all 6 of the nymphs in the bottom pool of folio 81R. Porcelain was historically used to sculpt beautiful figurines, but that's not really what I'm going for here. Instead, I care about capturing all the details, though they may not be pretty. After the clay slowly dries, it's time to fire it in a kiln and add some color. It goes through 2 firings, which reach temperatures of over 1,200 degrees Celsius or 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. After that, there's an extra step of adding gold luster, which requires a 3rd kiln firing. Finally, the sculpture was ready to assemble. But there was one problem. I needed a way to support all of the nymphs so they wouldn't fall over when I poured epoxy resin into the pool. All the credit goes to my husband for building this amazing structure out of connects. I'm definitely going to use this design again next time I have a bunch of nymphs that need support. I poured several layers of green epoxy resin, and finally, a new sculpture was ready to reveal.
So,
All right. And I'm also here.
Cary.
Hello. Michael says beautifully done. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lucy.
This is also Cary's work. I don't know if you can read it. All right. So, during the last couple of months, I've been terrorizing people on Voynich Ninja Forum with polls for we did 16 polls, 8 plants each, to determine once and for all what our favorite plant is from the manuscript. So this is what one poll looked like, and so one plant per batch went on to the next round. And so after a while, when all those 16 tournament stage polls were done, we had 4 semifinals. These were the candidates that well, you could choose one from, and then the idea was that from each batch of 4, one would go on to the big final. From the semifinals, we can. I noticed some interesting things. One is that you guys seem to like very big flowers, and also these blue weirdos. There are a couple of those. Another is that you prefer A plants. There are just a couple of B plants. Now there are way more A plants in the manuscript, but by that I mean plants on Courier A folios. But even if we calculate for how many B plants we would expect proportionally, they're still underrepresented. So you think B plants are probably like even uglier than A plants. For the final, these were the last 4 remaining plants we could choose from, and people found it very hard to pick one because you have all these really iconic and quite diverse plants from the manuscript. 26 people voted, which is actually good. From all other polls I've done, I don't think I've ever got 26 people to push a button. So that's a good representative sample for our forum. This was the tally halfway through. So plant number 1 here, folio 116V, was just a clear winner at that point. I thought it was over already, that it would be boring. There was some competition from plant number 4, which was also the one I voted for, by the way. And then the 2 other ones didn't stand a chance. After 21 votes, though, that completely shifted, and there was now a tie between plant number 1 and plant number 2. The one here with the curly thing. Also, like, no complaints from me here. They're all really beautiful plants, so that's really great. Plant number 3 didn't stand a chance anymore at this point. And plant number 4 was doing okay, but lagging behind at this point. I also knew that after 21 votes, I would not get many more, so I was just... and so at that point, whenever someone voted, the tie was kept in base. So after 25 votes, we were here, 8 votes each for plant number 1 and plant number 2, and only 1 vote difference between plant number 3 and plant number 4. And then it really seemed like no one else would vote, so I asked my beautiful wife, Cary, here next to me, if she could cast the final vote. But for this once, I did not ask her to break the tie, so I did not tell her what the scores were, and I just said, you still have to vote. And I thought, well, we can have 2 winners if she doesn't break the tie. But I thought, well, if these are two most popular plants, she'll probably pick one of those, and we'll have a clear winner. What she did was the following. She made a second tie. So
I have to say it was a really hard choice because I like a lot of the Voynich plants.
So yeah, but it was really annoying that you made a second tie. So yeah, so okay, well, do we have two winners then? There would have been these two. Okay, I would have personally preferred one winner, but there were two, or were there? So while Tavi was doing her beautiful presentation, I was working on this, and I actually saw that due to some miscommunication on the forum, one person's vote was counted twice. So we do have one winner.
Wow, that's a really unexpected plot twist.
It's my presentation. So your favorite plant is 116V, which is not entirely unexpected because it's also a plant that's very often selected by people when they make like a book. I think it's also
on the cover of the Yale.
Yeah, right. So there must be something about it that draws people's attention and that they really like. This is what people had to say about the plant. They love the color contrast. There was a lot of mention of the balance of the colors and so on. The shape of the leaves and the flower. Overall, it's just the most beautiful plant. And one person loved its enchanting scent, which is synesthesia, I guess. Probably this person can tell us what it smells like. Probably dead cow, if it like leather, if it has a scent. But so conclusion, we now have an officially best or at least favorite Voynich plant, and it's folio 16V. Oh, there is a question from Michael Greshko. Cary, how long did it take you to sculpt your sculpture?
Okay. Thanks for the question. So normally, it's actually hard to answer that because for this particular sculpture, I started it actually a couple of years ago. I put it aside. A lot of other stuff was going on, and I was actually moving my studio to another country. I'm in Belgium now. So it took me over 2 years to make this sculpture, but if I had been working steadily, it may have only taken a few months. So it's really hard to say. But hopefully now I'll be getting back into making some new sculptures again.
There's always the drying time. So even if you wanted to like make this in 5 days that you don't sleep and work nonstop, then you couldn't because
for anything with porcelain, there is a drying time. Once the sculpture is modeled, it has to dry for several weeks. Then it has to go through several kiln firings. So for porcelain, it's quite a process. For glass sculptures, it's a bit of a faster process, but still can take some time.
No, and
Thank you very much.
Someone asked about the sculptures behind me. So yes, these are all Cary sculptures. I don't know, like my webcam isn't super HD, but here behind me is a single nymph that she made pretty long ago. Wasn't this one of your first?
That was, yeah, several years ago.
Yeah. And then here is the one from the choir 13, like that's holding that thing.
See this one up close. I can bring it closer to the camera.
Yeah.
So this is one that everyone should recognize. And this is made with porcelain, glass, and epoxy resin. So I did something similar here. You can see she's standing in a pool. That's epoxy resin. The object she's holding is glass, which I flame worked by hand, and the rest of it is porcelain. So I started this technique with resin in the pools. And so this one that I just finished is a continuation of that.
She also has these lighted plasma sculptures, but we don't really have any up here. But she's shown some of those before. And hopefully she'll be able to make new ones as soon as her studio is set up here.
Yeah. Someone asks if the sculptures are for sale. If anyone wants to ask me about purchasing a sculpture, please email me. You can find my email in the chat. I'll just put it here. Or you can go to my website and also you can see how to contact me there. Or you can contact me on the forum.
Yeah.
Many different
Or
ways.
me.
Can you see me and the thing that I'm sharing?
Yeah, you're good.
So you're seeing my presentation here, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay. Well, so apologies for my bad English, my bad English pronunciation, but so I'm going to talk about Voynich origin theories in general, why you need one, why you cannot avoid having one, and what it will do to your reputation. So I hope that I can. So what is an origin theory? It's a theory that says basically how the manuscript came to be. So it includes the persons that were involved in its creation, not necessarily the idea of the identity of those persons, but the kind of persons that they were, and so forth. So when it says when it was created, where it was created, what happened to the physical object from its inception to the present day. Also, observations and elucubrations around what kind of contents is in the manuscript. What did the author want to put in there? Whether they are observations that the author made, or are elucubrations. I mean, like the Hong Cottage, maybe, or a chronicle, or a copy, transcripts of other books or whatever. And also why he decided to create it, because the contents was original. Why he decided to choose that contents? Why he decided to invent a special script for it? Why did he put those figures in the book? Why there is no plain text that we can read now? Not a single. Okay, what an origin theory does not include is what specific language the manuscript is in, what encryption method was used, and what is the deciphered text, because that is a separate thing, which is a decipherment theory, not an origin theory. Okay. So there are some things that we have, I think, reached a consensus, probably, hopefully, about, for instance, about the origin of the manuscript. We know when it was actually put to vellum, probably, almost certainly, in the first half of the 1400s. We have the dates of the vellum, for instance, and also the stylistic considerations. We also may have a consensus on where it was put to vellum, when it was written. Put to vellum, I mean someone actually dipped the pen in the ink and wrote on the vellum. That's as opposed to when it was first conceived by the author, I mean, right? And that must be in Europe. We also have some consensus about what the kind of contents is there. Well, of course, there are always people who disagree. We have other ideas about that, but most people seem to agree that the herbal section is a herbal section, the zodiac section is a zodiac section, and so forth. There are other sections that are much more mysterious, and there seems to be no consensus about those. And also another thing that I hope that it is consensus is that the contents was sourced from other books. the argument for that is that, well, there is such a wide variety of topics that it's unlikely that the contents is something that the author himself discovered. So it probably took the herbal information from some pre-existing herbal book, the zodiac and the astronomical sections from some books in astronomy, and so forth. We may question that later. We may discuss that if you want and if you have time. And the reason why the book was created, I think that's the part that there is zero consensus. I mean, why did the author decide to write the book, and why did he decide to write it that way? Now, about the who was the person who created the book? Maybe we can reach the consensus on the following items. Well, there were two persons involved. There was the author who chose the contents, devised the script and the encryption if it is encrypted. And I mean, he must have been an educated person, but he was not rich because, well, the vellum that is very poor quality and doesn't seem to be something, so I think that's the only things that we can maybe agree upon, hopefully. There is still a lot of space in that about, say, was he a scholar, was he a monk, or something like that. And there is this scribe who is the person who physically wrote the book on the vellum. And I proposed that he was not the author. Well, first of all, if there were several scribes, then of course, if there were n scribes, n minus one of them cannot be the author, unless the author is a split personality, and each personality has its own handwriting. But I also argue that even if there were only one scribe, it would not be the author for several reasons that I don't think I have time to go into here. We can take that on the forum. He certainly, the scribe was European. His writing skill was medium, but not in Voynichese. I mean, he probably was very experienced in using the pen and ink, but probably to write Latin or some other language like that. And it was pretty new to Voynichese. His artistic skill, however, was rather poor at the beginning, but he learned it along. You can see in the zodiac section, for instance, that there is a progression between very badly drawn nymphs and so forth to slightly better ones further on along in the section. I propose that his knowledge, he only knew about the alphabet of the script. He didn't know what the language was, what the encryption was, if there is an encryption, and what the contents of the book was. But I mean, presumably the author gave him the sample of the alphabet. He practiced it until the author was satisfied, and then he just copied a draft that the author gave him. There again, I don't have time, I suppose, to go into the details, the reason why I think so. I think that there was a draft that the author wrote, and there was a scribe that copied the draft to the vellum. It must have taken 6 months, maybe, depending on how much of the scribe worked per day. Whatever. The scribe only painted a light yellow paint at most. I mean, there is a light yellow paint that is used everywhere in the book, and all the other colors were painted by someone much later. There were many other interventions that came after that. I will again not talk about that. Now, some people say that, well, we shouldn't bother discussing origin theories at this point because, well, we don't have enough data to make any meaningful discussion. It is a distraction. It's not helpful. There's no consensus. It would be disputed. I mean, needless needless dispute. It's not scientific and whatever. So we should first decipher the text, and then this text itself will either tell us who is the author and everything else, or it will give us enough clues that we can meaningfully discuss those things. But so, well, this agnostic approach has some merit. I mean, all those arguments are reasonable, but unfortunately, I don't think that we can be agnostic. We need an origin theory to do any sort of research on the Voynich manuscripts, because it is the origin theory that will tell us which parts of the manuscripts are important, which details are significant, which questions we should ask, which interpretations of what we see make sense, what languages are likely, what encryption methods are likely, and the amount of errors and type of errors that we expect to see that exist in the manuscript. Both scribal errors, author errors, and other errors that happen because of later accidents, like people spilling ketchup on the manuscript. So we need an origin theory. So again, in fact, we cannot avoid having one, because if you do any sort of research, like for instance, counting how many gallows there are on beginning or end of the lines, you must have to assume some things about how the manuscript was produced. For instance, in my own origin theory, I think that beginnings and ends of lines are not important. They were decided by the scribe, and therefore that analysis of how many gallows appear on beginning and end of lines, while there might be real differences between those statistics, they are not important. Same thing about the figures. I think that many of the figures were just created by the scribe himself, because the author maybe just said to him, "Oh, well, put some nymphs in there, those nymphs that you can draw. I mean, put them in the zodiac diagram in each sector, put one of those." And that's so looking at the details of how many say how many points of the stars have. I think we can tabulate those, but I don't think they are meaningful. If you say that the manuscript is a hoax, then you must have assuming an origin theory that says, well, the author must have created a hoax to fool someone, and then you must think of what kind of person the author was trying to fool, and so forth. Anyway, and the most important thing is that when you publish any sort of analysis or any sort of proposal for decipherment, some people, very few people, will actually take the trouble of looking into your proposal, the details, and try to see whether the proposal makes sense. If you propose that it is a Mongolian-based Templar jargon theory of decipherment, very few people will take Mongolian and Basque dictionaries and try to figure out whether your decipherment makes sense. Most people, almost everybody, will just accept or reject your theory, your proposal, based on the origin theory that it implies. So, I mean, most people will reject the Mongolian Basque Templar theory because, well, they think that such a thing couldn't have possibly existed. Same thing about the Chinese theory. Many people have rejected the Chinese theory just because they think it is unlikely that there was that the way that they proposed that the manuscript would be created is unlikely, and so forth. And same thing for the hoax theory. I don't waste time looking into hoax proposals because I think I cannot see an origin theory that makes sense that would fit the idea of a hoax. Well, that's it. Sorry about exceeding a little bit, I think. So just, well, when you final message, when you make some proposal of the decryption or whatever, be aware of what origin theory you are assuming. Make sure that it's minimally plausible, state it explicitly if possible, and be prepared for violent rejections based exclusively on the origin theory, not on the merits of your proposal or analysis. Okay, sorry, well, again, sorry for taking too long. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I've always thought of you as Stolfi, but I'll try to use your first name.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, people in Brazil, people here call me Stolfi.
Oh, right.
So I use it George sometimes because in the States people use the first names, whatever.
Yes. So I think we'll go on right away to our next presenter. Michael, on forum also known as Magnesium, you're gonna tell us something about a method you came up with. Well, the floor is yours.
Cool. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you, Cohen, for organizing this and for everybody for being here. So I guess we'll get into it. This is how the talk is going to be structured. And with that, let's get started. I'm going to be presenting a cipher of my own creation that tries really hard to mimic the Voynich manuscript, and you might be wondering, why should anyone do this? Why did I do this? The short answer is because it's cool, it's fun, and it's interesting. This began for me as a personal art project. I had no intention of this spiraling into the research project it ended up becoming. And I think it's a really interesting research project because this exercise, if you've not done it, is a really cool way of playing around with ideas for how the text of the manuscript may have been generated. Because that's one thing we can agree on, right? Whether the manuscript represents a ciphertext, whether it's gibberish, maybe it's the written form of an unusual or poorly documented language. One thing is clear, the text was generated somehow. We know that because we have the manuscript. And I would argue that it would be more probable for us to see the manuscript as it is if the underlying method of text generation often and reliably yielded text like the Voynich manuscript, which is to say that the manuscript probably doesn't represent an edge case of its own generation method. So to that end, I think it's really interesting and useful to look at reference models that reliably generate text that qualitatively or quantitatively mimics aspects of the manuscript. One of the more prominent recent models is the self-citation algorithm created by Torsten Timm and Andreas Schinner, which does a really good job of mimicking certain properties of the manuscript. Of course, it is a random generation method. There is no meaning to the text it generates. So the question I want to pose is, can we devise a fully functional cipher that is also a viable reference model for Voynich manuscript text generation? I'm going to argue the answer to this question is yes, but first, let's define some rules of the road. These are the design principles that I used when designing the Naibbe cipher. First and foremost, this is pretty straightforward. We need to replicate as many properties of the Voynich manuscript as possible at the same time. In addition, though, we don't know what the underlying plaintext of the manuscript is, or indeed if it is a ciphertext at all. So the cipher we create needs to not be fine-tuned to any one plaintext. We're going to design the cipher so that it works reliably across a wide range of plaintexts. In addition, we're going to design the cipher so that it could have been doable in the early 1400s. Encryption and decryption need to be able to be done fully by hand using only 15th century materials. Bonus points if we can place those materials in Central Europe and specifically the Alpine region in the early 15th century. In addition, the cipher needs to be designed in such a way that ambiguities in decryption are rare and accidental. So many proposed solutions to the manuscript over the years, and indeed some more recent computational analyses of the manuscript, explicitly or implicitly hold that the reader of the manuscript has an enormous amount of agency in how to actually extract information from the manuscript. I see that as at odds with the idea that this is potentially like a medical reference text. So we're going to design the cipher in such a way that the reader has very little agency in how to actually decrypt the text and thus can reliably extract information out of it. And to that end, we're going to try to achieve all of these points while encrypting the full sequence of plaintext letters in order without any nulls. I'm pleased to say that I have identified a cipher that can do all 5 of these things at the same time. And let's just jump straight into how that cipher works. So it works with pretty much any Latin or Italian text. For an example here, I'm using the first 3 words of the Aeneid, Arma virumque cano. We're going to strip that plain text of its original punctuation, casing, diacritics, and spacing. And then we're going to respace it so that it's roughly 50-50 one-letter chunks, or unigrams, and two-letter chunks, or bigrams. Now, you may have noticed at this point that a given letter can be in one of only 3 different states when we respace it this way. It can be by itself, it can be a unigram, it could be the first letter in a bigram, or the second letter in a bigram. Now, we're going to be encrypting letters in these different states in different ways, and here's how that works. We're going to be encrypting standalone unigrams as entire Voynichese word types. We're going to be encrypting bigrams as word types as well, where the first letter of the bigram is the prefix, and the second letter of the bigram is the suffix. The idea here is to encrypt bigrams as Voynichese word types that do not match the specific word types that are reserved for unigrams. There are 6 different options in the cipher for how to encrypt a given letter in a given state. So for example, that green M you see there, that unigram M, there are 6 unique word types within the cipher that encrypt a standalone M. Now you might be wondering to yourself, okay, well, how do we choose between these different options? And the answer is kind of given away by the name of the cipher itself. We're going to be using playing cards. Now, I'm not saying that playing cards were literally used to create the manuscript, but they serve a really convenient role in this cipher, and they were historically plausible. Playing cards were introduced to Europe in the late 14th century via trade with the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled what is now Egypt. One of the oldest records that we have in Europe of playing cards comes to us from Florence, where in 1377 the city prohibited the foreign card game Naibbe, which appears to be some kind of loan word from Arabic. We know that playing cards proliferated across Europe in the early 15th century, and we know that they were in and around the Alpine region in the first half of the 1400s. We know this in part because in 1441, Venetian playing card artisans complained to the government that their industry was in decay and ruin at the hands of foreign competition. So if an industry is in decline, by the early 1440s, it was bigger earlier, pushing it squarely into the window when the manuscript is thought to have been made. Again, playing cards are plausible. I'm not saying they were literally used. But the way that they're used in the cipher is that the cipher substitution options are organized into 6 tables, as you can see here. Each table lists one option per plain text letter for each of the letter's three possible states. So if a letter is a standalone unigram, the table offers one word type for that letter. If it's first in a bigram, one prefix, second in a bigram, one suffix. The tables are chosen in roughly 5 to 2 to 2 to 2 to 1 to 1 ratios, which is just to say that 1 is chosen roughly 5/13ths of the time when encrypting a given letter. The next three are each chosen roughly 2/13ths of the time. The two rarest are each chosen roughly 1/13th of the time. I will be referring to these as the primary table, alpha, the secondary tables, beta 1 through 3, and the tertiary tables, gamma 1 and 2. The way this works is we're going to draw a card out of a deck of playing cards, and the identity of that card is going to determine on a letter-by-letter basis which table we use to encrypt that letter. I have two versions of the cipher, both of which use deck designs that are known to have existed in 15th century Europe. One of them is the 78 card Tarocchi deck, otherwise known as the tarot deck, which was created in 15th century Italy, not for divination, but for playing trick-taking card games. These are 4 of the 78 cards in the surviving Solabusca deck, which was created in the 1490s in northern Italy. That was my reference Tarocchi deck for experimental encipherments. This is the mapping that we use. So if we draw a card and it is of the suit clubs or swords, then we're going to choose the primary table, and so on and so forth. If you're not familiar with Italian suited tarot decks, that's okay. This can be readily adapted to any tarot deck that you may have. In addition, I have a version of the cipher that uses a 52 card deck, which is known to have existed in Europe. And this general deck design was firmed up in the Mamluk Sultanate prior to the introduction of playing cards to Europe. There are surviving examples of 52 card decks from 15th century Europe. This one was made probably in the 1470s and is currently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The way this works is that we map the tables to the values of the playing card. So if we draw an ace, 2, 3, 4, or 5, regardless of the suit, we're going to be choosing the primary table alpha, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to show you how this works in sort of the simulated encipherment. In the bottom right, it's going to be the value of the card we're choosing. We're going to be using the 52 card variant of the cipher here. We draw a 7. So we then consult the table that corresponds to a drawn 7. And then we copy down what the table says is what we should use for that letter in that state. So in this case, it's an A, that's the first letter in a bigram. So we're going to write down what the table says is the appropriate substitution option, in this case, YT. All right, so we're halfway done with this word. Next, we're going to draw a 10. We're going to consult the table that corresponds to a drawn 10, and we're going to copy down what it says we should put for an R that's the second letter in a bigram, in this case, the suffix EEOR. And that is how encryption proceeds. We draw cards, we then consult the table, and we write down what the table says. Now, if we had chosen a different sequence of playing cards, we would have encrypted our text in a different way. And indeed, all of these examples are the exact same sequence of plain text engrams, but just encrypted in different ways. In general, with one exception, a unigram can be represented in 6 different ways. A given bigram can be represented in 36 different ways, 6 prefixes, 6 suffixes per letter. And overall, the Naibbe cipher can generate well more than 12,000 readily decipherable word types. The real limit here is not actually what the cipher can do, but rather just the number of bigrams that Latin and Italian texts tend to exhibit. You might be wondering how we decrypt these ciphertexts. Well, the short answer is that we just need to reliably get from here back to here. Identify the word types that correspond to unigrams, and then identify and break apart the words that represent plain text bigrams. And we do this with decoding tables that list out unigram word types, the bigram prefixes, and the bigram suffixes next to their matching plain text letters. If a given ciphertext token matches a word type that is reserved exclusively for unigrams, that is how we decrypt it. If we're careful on the front end for how we encrypt, there's no ambiguity whatsoever. If on the in the off chance that you encrypted a bigram accidentally as a unigram word type, 90% of the time the unigram interpretation is correct, just because it's probabilistically favorable for it to be how that token was generated. But if a word type doesn't match a known unigram word type, then congratulations, we've got a bigram where the prefix is one letter and the suffix is another. And we can readily tease that apart because the prefixes and suffixes tend to be generated in two different ways. I'm using a modified version of Massimiliano Zatara's slot grammar here. I've basically broken it down the middle and I've modified it. Most prefixes are generated with the table on the left. I call these type 1 affixes. Most suffixes are generated with the table on the right, which I call type 2 affixes. The colored glyphs that I have highlighted here are unique to each affix type, so they provide a really clean way of seeing what the breakpoint is between the prefix and the suffix. These unique glyphs give us easy prefix-suffix breakpoints. If they happen to be absent, we can always refer back to this grammar. Basically, we identify what that breakpoint is within a given bigram word type, and then we look up the prefix and suffix separately in our decoding tables. So the Naibbe cipher can generate pretty efficiently text that is readily decipherable while using the Voynich's glyph set and the Voynich's word grammar. Now let's talk a bit about the properties of these ciphertexts, which I think will be of great interest to people. Now, unless I state otherwise, the following results are based on the average of 20 runs of the cipher, encrypting a 32,000 letter plaintext as a ciphertext that varies between 20 and 21,000 tokens long. The cipher works super reliably with an extremely wide range of Latin and Italian plaintexts. So the standard plaintext, when I refer to it, is actually a four-parter. It's equal parts of Book 16 of Pliny's Natural History, Robert Grosseteste's 13th century astronomy treatise De Sphera, the 14th century alchemical herbal, as compiled and corrected by Marco Ponzi, and Dante's Divine Comedy in the original Italian. So for one, we're either using Voynich's word types wholesale or we're generating them with a modified version of Zatara's really high-performing slot grammar. So we are obeying the grammar, and just as a proof of concept, I have added in the rare glyphs X and G, just to demonstrate how this kind of cipher could handle some of the rare glyphs that appear in the manuscript. The cipher does a very good job of replicating the glyph frequencies within Voynich B specifically, which will be our reference from here on out. You'll see why in a second. These are using the EVA transliteration. These are the glyph frequencies in Voynich B. Here is just a representative Naibbe ciphertext. Toggle back and forth between these, but we do a pretty good job of replicating the glyph frequencies in Voynich B. But not only that, we do a pretty good job of replicating the frequencies of glyph pairs, as often visualized in this way. Each square on this grid represents a pair of glyphs. The color represents how common or rare it is relative to chance. So this is Voynich B using the EVA transliteration. This is a Naibbe ciphertext. I'll toggle back and forth here. It's not perfect, but it gets a lot right. And you may be wondering, this is EVA. What about other transliterations? Good question. I've also looked at this using Cuva. This is Voynich B, and this is a Naibbe ciphertext. Again, it's not perfect, but we get a lot right. Now, because we're using the Voynich's word grammar, which has a very rigorous and predictable arrangement of glyphs, it should be no surprise that we do a good job of replicating the entropy of the text as well. The two X's you see here on this plot are Voynich B. The one to the left is the EVA transliteration. The one to the right is the Cuva transliteration. This is what Naibbe ciphertexts do on average when encrypting the standard plaintext I mentioned. we do a very good job of replicating the entropy of the text as well. Now I want to talk a bit about the token and word type length distributions. These are fascinating. Jorge Stolfi, did pioneering work on noticing that the distributions of lengths here are very different from those of most natural languages, including Latin and English, as seen here. And this is where this whole journey for me began. I wanted to design a toy model cipher that could reliably generate the quasi-binomial token length distribution that the Voynich manuscript exhibits. And when I thought about this for a while, I realized that if you took a plain text and you broke it entirely into two-letter chunks, you could do this if any given letter was often represented by a string of 2 or 3 Voynichese glyphs, because that way the first half of the bigram is often 2 or 3 glyphs, the second half of the bigram is often 2 or 3 glyphs, which means together they're often 4 to 6 glyphs long, and you could get that kind of quasi-binomial distribution pretty reliably. So to test this idea further, I built a tool I call Voynichesque, which I can talk about more on the forum, which can randomly generate Voynich mimic ciphers that use the Zotera slot grammar. Now, I have analyzed hundreds of randomly generated ciphers this way, millions of tokens of ciphertexts. My conclusion is that to reliably replicate the Voynich manuscript's grammar, entropy, and token and type length distributions, a homophonic substitution cipher has to encrypt a plain text that is almost entirely unigrams and bigrams. And the simple reason for that is that the easiest way to achieve the entropy is for the cipher to be verbose, but if it's verbose, it's very easy to encrypt trigrams and longer n-grams as long word types. So if you have more than a few percent of those in the plain text, you overproduce long word types relative to what's observed in the manuscript. This is why the Naibbe cipher encrypts a unigram bigram plain text. And what that means is that we can very reliably generate quasi-binomial distributions of token and word type lengths that are very similar to those in the Voynich manuscript. And I'm calculating word length here as Jorge Stolfi did in this original work. So this is an apples to apples comparison. Now, what's cool is when these variants encrypt unigram bigram plain text, we actually get an extra property of the manuscript for free, which is very convenient. And when we do this, the ciphertext word types obey Zipf's law automatically. If you're not familiar, this is the power law distribution between the frequency of a given word type and its rank. This is a hallmark of natural language, and it's a defining statistical feature of the manuscript, one that is often cited as a hint that there's natural language hiding in the manuscript. This kind of cipher can generate this naturally because short n-grams have higher absolute frequencies in general than longer n-grams. And when you're using a homophonic substitution cipher on a letter-by-letter basis, you slice and dice the frequencies of longer n-grams all the more. So you just exaggerate that already stark difference. All of the commonest word types in this kind of cipher encrypt unigrams, which got me thinking, what if that were true for Voynich B? The Naibbe cipher's structure is the result of modeling the frequency rank distribution of Voynich B's 70 commonest word types as if all of them were unigrams encrypting using this kind of cipher. When you do this modeling, not only are the best fit plaintext alphabet language frequencies, not only are the best fit plaintext alphabet letter frequencies consistent with natural language, but they tend to resemble those of Latin and Romance languages, more so than other language families such as Slavic. Latin and early modern Italian provide stable and excellent fits, which is why this cipher is designed to be used specifically with Latin and Italian. All of this is to say that not only do Naibbe ciphertext obey Zipf's law, but they very reliably replicate the specific frequency rank distribution that is observed in Voynich B. Not only proportionally, but on an absolute basis as well. In addition, because the tables are so carefully constructed, we can reliably reproduce the frequencies of many specific word types within Voynich B, especially the common words. This is a graph in log-log space, so I'm really exaggerating the spread at low absolute frequencies on this plot. And what's all the more interesting is that we can achieve this reproduction even as the Naibbe table's unigram word types. In this case, this table, each column is the unigram word types from each of the 6 tables. The unigram word types here are very rigorously organized by prefix and suffix. Just to zoom in here, most of the word types, most of the unigram word types in a given table all use the same prefix, and most of the words across columns that stand for a given letter all have the same suffix. This organization can yield the excellent fit you see on the right half of this plot, which I find very interesting in no small part because this is how Trithemius generated word types in his artificial language cipher Polygraphia 3. As you can see, each column, there's a conserved prefix, and then the suffixes are constant across the columns for a given letter. This is by design. I'm explicitly emulating this, but it's kind of remarkable to me that this works as well as it does. Now, because the Naibbe cipher amounts to writing out strings of glyphs from tables, it's very easy to generate text that is smooth, orderly, and seemingly error-free in appearance, especially if you do a scratch paper encryption on either paper or which would have been available during the time period, or a wax tablet. I've also done some experimental encipherments using a wax tablet, which would have been a commonly available drafting surface at the time. Just to zoom in here, I felt certainly smooth and confident as I was doing this. This ciphertext, by the way, encrypts the first several hundred letters of Caesar's Gallic War in the original Latin. Now, what's also interesting, if you're just using this handwritten example, we can reliably generate clustering of similar looking word types. On successive lines, we can have words that vary by only one glyph, as seen in the manuscript. And we can also generate clusters of word types that all start with the same prefix and vary in the suffix, which is something that's also observed in the manuscript. And the reason that we can do this, again, is because most of the word types in a given unigram column in one of these tables, they all start with the same prefix. We can, if you happen to use one table very often when encrypting unigrams, you're going to naturally generate these clusters of words that all start with the same prefix. To expand on this idea, we can also talk about the edit distance between words. Basically, how many steps does it take if you're just changing one glyph at a time to get from one word to the other? Now, Torsten Timm and Andreas Schinner pointed out several years ago that the words in the Voynich manuscript, if you quantify this, are very similar to each other. You can create networks of words this way. And indeed, what they found for not only Voynich B, which is what's seen here, but across the manuscript, words are very, very similar in structure to each other and tend to separate out into 4 subdomains, here color-coded based on whether words resemble Dain, Ol, Chetty, and then this 4th catch-all category here in blue. Now, because we are very deliberately trying to mimic the frequency rank distribution of word types in Voynich B, we achieve very similar results when we do the same kind of network analysis for a Naibbe ciphertext. Again, we see not exactly the same, but we see the 4 subdomains appear. The overall connectivity of the network is extremely similar. So this kind of similarity is not in and of itself a definitive sign of the text being meaningless. In addition, Naibbe ciphertexts do a good job of replicating the morphological complexity of the Voynich manuscript. Several years ago, Luke Lindemann suggested that we look at the most common words measure and the moving average tight token ratio on the X and Y axis, respectively, to see how the Voynich manuscript compares to a lot of language families. What you need to know for this plot is that the Voynich manuscript are the black dots in the middle. This is where Naibbe ciphertexts fall out when encrypting this particular plain text. We overshoot, as you can see, on the moving average type token ratio, but otherwise we do a very good job of replicating the morphological complexity of the text. I want to talk a bit more about some of Tim and Schinner's other results. In response to Jürgen Hermes's 2022 conference presentation about polygraphy 3 being potentially a useful reference, Tim and Schinner point out that this cipher could not have literally been what created the manuscript, and that's because of the way that Trithemius designed the cipher. Basically, Trithemius said, okay, you're going to take the first letter of your plain text, you're going to encrypt it with the first column, the second letter, the second column, so on and so forth. But if your plain text has more letters than you have columns, then you start back at the first column. So you're cycling through these columns in a very consistent way. And if you do that, it means that the text will correlate with itself by however many columns you have. The black dashed line you see here simulates this kind of cipher being applied to Dante's Divine Comedy with 100 columns. And as you can see, the text auto-correlates with itself at offsets of 100 words because there's 100 columns. Now, the Voynich manuscript doesn't do this. The stars section of the manuscript is the jagged red line you see below. And I know what you're probably thinking. Why are you mentioning this? Well, the Naibbe cipher doesn't have any kind of cyclical quality to it, so it doesn't run into this autocorrelation problem. In fact, we come very close to replicating the observed degree of token autocorrelation in the manuscript. And we could take this one step further, actually. I just figured out how to do this on Thursday. This is a very late addition to the presentation. For the 2022 Voynich conference, Claire Bowen and Daniel Gaskell presented two papers that used a battery of 42 different statistical measurements of text. And we're trying to compare how the Voynich manuscript stacked up against a wide range of gibberish texts and ciphertexts and plain texts. What you need to know for this plot, basically, is that the Voynich manuscript is the red dots and the pink ranges. My Naibbe ciphertext is the blue dots and the light blue ranges. And as you kind of let your eyes drift down this plot, you'll tend to notice that the blue dots are most often close to the red dots. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Now, we can quantify this. If we take the Voynich manuscript's performance on these 42 different statistical tests as a vector in space, we can measure the distance between the Voynich manuscript's vector and the vector of a given text. So what I've done in the following plot is I have taken Bowen and Gaskell's entire corpus, which is like 930 texts, and I've added in my 20 Naibbe ciphertexts, and then I'm going to have a bunch of box and whisker plots, each one representing a text generation method. Okay. So, of all the text generation methods that Bowen and Gaskell looked at, the Naibbe cipher achieves the lowest average Euclidean distance from the Voynich manuscript, other than the Voynich manuscript itself. It outperforms reliably everything else that Bowen and Gaskell looked at. That's not to say that there aren't individual ciphertexts or individual texts that don't match or exceed that performance, but in terms of reliability, the Naibbe cipher outperforms everything. You can see on this plot that the EVA transliteration of the Voynich manuscript is on the left. We actually reliably outperform the V101 transliteration of the manuscript. And for reference, the text generated by Tim and Schinner's self-citation algorithm is in the green box I present here. In the interest, I should mention one other thing. Bowen and Gaskell developed this random forest classification model. They trained a machine learning model on known gibberish and known meaningful text, and then tried to classify the Voynich manuscript. And they found that this model, to low confidence, tended to associate it with gibberish. This same model treats Naibbe ciphertext the same way, even though we know that Naibbe ciphertext conveys meaning, albeit in a very unusual way. So this kind of classification model does not in and of itself mean that the Voynich manuscript is meaningless. There, in the interest of time, I don't have time to go into all of the properties of Naibbe ciphertext, but here are some other ones as well. I'm happy to talk about this in the forum, but to just give a quick preview of what's driving these various properties, here's a very quick and dirty explanation of how these properties are achieved in the Naibbe cipher. Now, I want to make very, very clear that the current version of the Naibbe cipher cannot be exactly how the manuscript was generated, and I want to emphasize that it's still unclear whether the manuscript even is a ciphertext. There are limitations to the cipher. I want to be very clear about this. Number one, these ciphertexts currently do not exhibit the long-range correlations at the bit level as observed by Andreas Schinner and others. This is a hallmark property of Voynich text. The Naibbe cipher currently doesn't do that. We can replicate about 83% of the tokens in Voynich B, but only about 45% of the word types in Voynich B. So we're clearly not capturing what's happening with especially rare words. Illustration labels are implied to be short and uninformative in this kind of cipher, right? If most words are only 1 or 2 letters long, that makes some of the labels just look weird. I have not fully modeled out the behavior of the manuscript at the line, paragraph, and page levels, which are obviously really important features of the manuscript. Happy to talk about this more, but I do think there's a path forward for how to modify or extend the Naibbe cipher to accommodate some of this work, as well as try to place constraints on what has to be true about the plain text in order to help support these properties arising. So in conclusion, the Naibbe cipher shows that verbose homophonic substitution ciphers acting on unigram, bigram, Latin and Italian plain text can yield ciphertext that is somewhat like the Voynich manuscript. The Naibbe cipher is imperfect. I want to be very clear about that. But it does achieve a lot of success at replicating the properties of Voynich B, so much so that it might be at least possible that Voynich B could contain a Latin or Romance language plaintext, which I hope further analysis of the manuscript will explore. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It's a really interesting presentation. Now, I'm not the right person to comment on this kind of statistics-heavy stuff, but there's a lot of activity in the chat. Now, we're a bit running out of time, but if you see anything in here that you would really like to react to now already, go ahead. And otherwise, we'll discuss everything on the forum. But
yeah, I will. So there's a couple questions about the sort of the playing cards in particular. So the reason that I'm using the playing cards is basically when I mentioned I did that modeling where I was trying to fit the frequency rank distribution of Voynich B. Basically, what has to be true about the structure of a substitution cipher and the plain text alphabet letter frequencies in order to make the 70 commonest words in Voynich B all represent standalone alphabet letters. And when you do that, I found that you need some skew, so not all the options in the cipher. I found that 6 substitution options per letter on average works really well for reasons I can elaborate on. And that if you have 6 substitution options per letter, they can't all be applied equally. There has to be some skew, and that skew is the 5 to 2 to 2 to 2 to 1 to 1. So in order to make this more historically plausible, I needed to come up with an analog way to achieve that super reliably. Now, it's possible that those ratios could just represent the subjective preferences of a couple of scribes, right? If you're looking at Voynich B, the statistics here are going to be dominated by scribes 2 and 3, with a smattering of some other scribes. But this could just represent kind of the aggregate average preferences of scribes 2 and 3. But for the purposes of this, I wanted to see, could I come up with an analog way to super reliably do that? And the answer there is to have a reliable way of choosing between 6 different subtypes, right? The 6 different tables, where all of those add up to a multiple of 13. And so one natural way to do that in the early 15th century would have been to use a deck of 52 13 times 4 or 78 13 times 6 playing cards. And then to the question for Bob, is the presentation available? So this recording is going to be available. I have also, the Bowen and Gaskell stuff is brand new. I just figured out how to run that code on Thursday night, but everything else in here and more, I have written up a full paper and I submitted it to Cryptologia a week ago. So stay tuned.
How long have you been doing Voynich research, Michael?
Off and on for, I mean, this was really this, I was trying to write a feature. I'm a journalist professionally, so I was trying to research, pitching and maybe writing like a magazine feature about the manuscript several years ago. The work that you see here really clicked into place in the last year or so. I mentioned this Voynich-esque tool that I developed. That was the original cipher. I was like, this is the art project. This is fun. But then I started to study the properties of that text, and I was like, wait a second, hold on. So the work represented in this paper really intensified starting last November.